The Gift of the Magi, written by O. Henry, adapted and told by Dr. Joel Ying. $1.87. That was all. And 60 cents of it in pennies. Pennies saved 1 or 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with embarrassment. 3 times Della counted it. Only $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. There was nothing to do but flop in the shabby little couch and howl. So Della did it. And in that moment she decided that life was made up of sobs and sniffles and smiles, with sniffles predominating. At $8 per week, the run-down furnished apartment was all they could afford. In the lobby below was a letterbox into which no letter would go, an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. The name on the box read, Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been added during a period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 per week. But now that the income had shrunk to $20, a modest and unassuming D seemed more appropriate. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home, he was called Jim and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, and all was good again. Della finished her cry, wiped her tears. She stood in front of the window and looked out drearily at the gray cat crossing the gray fence in the gray backyard. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and she only had $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She'd been saving every penny she could for months. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been more than she'd calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 with which to buy a present for Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she'd spent planning for something nice. Something fine and rare and sterling. Something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. Della whirled suddenly from the window and stood in front of the full-length mirror. She stared at her slender form. Her eyes sparkled brilliantly, but within 20 seconds her face had lost its color. She pulled her hair down quickly to its full length. Now there were 2 possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs, in which they took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold pocket watch. It had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the way, Della would have let her hair hang out some days to dry, just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor, with all of his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to watch him pluck his beard with envy. So now, Della's beautiful hair fell about her, rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It fell below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her. She put it up again nervously. She faltered for a moment and stood while a tear or 2 splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown coat, on went her old brown hat, and with a whirl of her skirts and that brilliant sparkle still in her eye, she fluttered out the door, down the stairs, into the street. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Sofronie, hair goods of all kinds. 1 flight up Della ran and collected herself panting. Madame Sofronie was too large, too pale, cold. She did not possess the beauty of the name Sofronie. Will you buy my hair? Said Della. I buy hair, said Madame. Take your hat off. Let's take a look. Down came the brown cascades. $20, said Madame, lifting the hair with a practiced hand. Give it to me quick, said Della. For the next 2 hours, she was on a cloud of joy. She was ransacking the stores to find Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned them all inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design. It was worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him, quietness and valuable. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 87 cents. As grand as the watch was, Jim sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap he used in place of a chain. When Della arrived home, her excitement gave way to a little prudence and reason. She took out her curling irons, and she began to repair the ravages made by generosity added to love. Within 40 minutes, her head was covered with tiny, low-lying curls that made her look like a truant schoolboy. Della looked at her reflection in the mirror long and hard. "If Jim doesn't kill me before he takes a second look at me," she said, "he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girl. But what could I do? What could I do with $1.87? At 7 o'clock, the coffee was made, and the frying pan was on the back of the stove hot and ready to make dinner. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain in her hand, and she sat on the edge of the table near the door where he always entered. When she heard his steps on the first flight of stairs, for a moment she turned white. She had a habit of saying silent little prayers for the simplest everyday things, and now she whispered, "Please, God, make him think I'm still pretty." The door opened and Jim stepped in. He looked thin and very serious for a man of 22. He needed a new overcoat and he was without gloves. He stopped just inside the door and froze. His eyes were fixed on Della, and there was an expression in them that she could not read, and it terrified her. It was not anger, no surprise, no horror, no disapproval, no any of the sentiments that she had been prepared for. He simply stared at her fixedly, with that peculiar expression on his face. Della wriggled off the table and went to him. "Jim, darling, don't look at me like that. I had my hair cut off and sold because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow back again. You won't mind, will you? My hair grows awfully fast. Say Merry Christmas, Jim, and let's be happy. You don't know what a nice, beautiful gift I've got you." "You've cut off your hair?" asked Jim, as if he'd not yet arrived at the obvious fact despite the hardest mental calculation. "Cut it off and sold it," said Della. "Don't you like me just as well anyhow? I'm still me without my hair, aren't I?" Jim looked about the room curiously. "You say your hair is gone," he said slowly, almost with an air of idiocy. "You needn't look for it," said Della. "It's sold and gone, I tell you. It's Christmas Eve. Be good to me, Jim. I did it for you. Maybe the hairs on my head were numbered, but nobody could count my love for you. Shall I put the dinner on, Jim?" As if out of a trance, Jim seemed to suddenly awaken. He embraced his Della. He pulled a package out of his overcoat pocket and threw it on the table. "Don't misunderstand me, Della. I don't think there's anything in the way of a haircut, or even a shave or a shampoo, that could make me like my girl any less. But if you'll open that package over there, you'll see why you had me going for a while at first." White fingers and nimble, she tore at the paper and strings, and then an ecstatic scream of joy. And then, alas, a quick change to hysterical tears and wails, necessitating all the comforting powers that Jim could muster. For there lay the combs, the set of combs, side and back, that Della had worshipped long in a Broadway window. Beautiful combs, pure tortoiseshell, with jeweled rim, just the shade to wear with beautiful varnished hair. They were expensive combs, she knew, and her heart had simply craved and yearned over them without the least hope of possession. and now they were hers. But the tresses that should have adorned them were gone. Della hugged them to her bosom, and at length she was able to look up with dim eyes and smile and say, "My hair grows so fast, Jim." And then Della leapt up like a singed little cat. Oh! Jim had not yet seen his beautiful present. She held it out to him eagerly. The dull, precious metal seemed to flash with the reflection of her bright and ardent spirit. "Isn't it dandy, Jim? I hunted all over town to find it. You'll have to check the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch. I want to see what it looks like on it." But instead, Jim tumbled down on the couch, put his hands under the back of his head, looked up and smiled. "Della," he said, "let's put our Christmas gifts away and keep them a while. They're just too good to use right now. I sold the watch to get the money to buy your combs. Why don't you put on the dinner?" And so she did. The Magi were wise men who gave gifts to a babe in a manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. They gave wise and valuable gifts. And here, two foolish young people most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But let it be said, of all those who give, and of all those who receive gifts, these two were the wisest. They are the Magi.